Welcome to The Explainer. In a world that can feel pretty hostile to faith, it brings up a huge question. How should a Christian respond? Do you fight back? Do you just turn the other cheek? Well, today we're going to explore the framework for responding to hostility, and we're pulling from some really deep theological and historical Christian sources to do it.
Okay, let's just dive right in. This quote from the Gospel of John really flips the script on the whole issue from the get-go. What it's suggesting is that any hostility you might face, it isn't necessarily a personal attack on you, it's actually a reflection of a much deeper spiritual opposition to Christ himself.
So, to really get our heads around this, we've got a bit of a roadmap. First, we're going to look at why hostility is seen as something to be expected, not a surprise. Then, we'll dig into what causes it, we'll look at this idea of a third way to respond, check out a powerful example from the early church, and finally, we'll try to understand the theological purpose behind all of it.
All right, so let's start with this idea that's kind of counterintuitive. Hostility shouldn't be a shock. The sources are really clear on this. For believers, facing opposition isn't presented as a maybe, but as a certainty. And you see this idea pop up all over the place in Christian scripture.
This whole concept really comes into focus in the Sermon on the Mount, and you have to pay attention to the specific wording here. It says, "Blessed are you when others revile you," not if. You see the difference? It's not a hypothetical. And according to the sources, that single word is meant to completely change a believer's mindset from one of shock to one of, preparation.
And then the Apostle Paul just takes it even further, leaving zero room for doubt. He basically frames persecution as a direct, almost guaranteed result of a sincere faith. The message couldn't be clearer. If you're truly committed, you should expect this. It's just part of the deal.
Okay, so if hostility is expected, then what's actually causing it? Well, all the sources we looked at point to one main thing: a fundamental clash of values, a collision of worldviews.
At its very core, persecution is seen as this collision between two value systems that just can't be reconciled. It's not about little personal disagreements, it's about the central beliefs of the Christian faith rubbing up against the dominant values of the culture around it.
And you see this clash play out over all sorts of specific issues. The sources point out that when the Bible's principles on things like morality or justice are seen as pushing back against a world that wants to define its own truth, friction is pretty much the natural result.
And here's the crucial turning point in the whole theological argument. The hostility isn't just seen as social or political. It's believed to be rooted in something unseen, a spiritual opposition to Christ that then kind of spills over and shows up in the physical world.
So, with this clash being inevitable, what's the recommended response? Well, it's not about just passively taking it, and it's definitely not about aggressive retaliation. The sources propose something totally different, what some have called a third way. It's not fight or flight, it's something else entirely.
And this really gets to the heart of it. There's this powerful distinction made. The goal isn't to win an argument, right? Because that often just makes people dig in their heels even more. The goal is to win a heart. The whole focus shifts from being right to maybe, just maybe, helping transform the other person.
You know these famous teachings, turn the other cheek, go the second mile. They're reframed here not as being a doormat, but as active strategic choices. The idea is that these are actually powerful ways to break the cycle of violence and to assert your own humanity and dignity, even when you're being oppressed.
This quote brings us to a really difficult, even painful reality that some sources call the theology of losing friends. It's this idea that sometimes staying true to your convictions means you might have to let a relationship go. It's presented as this incredibly challenging but maybe necessary part of honoring your faith when compromise just isn't on the table. But hey, this isn't all just abstract theory. We can actually see these principles playing out in the real world, starting with the very first Christians. The book of Acts, in chapter 4, gives us an incredible case study.
So check out the sequence of events here. It's pretty striking. The apostles do something, and it leads directly to official opposition. But instead of backing down or fighting back, they respond with this bold defiance. And get this, what does their community do? They pray. But not for safety. They pray for even more boldness.
And this was their powerful answer to the authorities. It's basically a declaration that for them, speaking out wasn't just a choice, it was a compulsion. Their personal experience was so real, so profound, that they felt they had to share it, no matter what the consequences were.
But of course, this brings up a huge question. Why would God even allow this to happen in the first place?
And that brings us to our final theme, the search for a theological purpose inside of all this suffering and persecution.
So the argument from the sources is that these trials aren't just random, meaningless events. They're actually seen as a tool, something used to bring about really deep growth for the individual and for the whole community. It's often described as a refining process, like fire purifying gold.
Scripture actually lays out a clear progression. It's like a chain reaction. It starts with suffering, which is said to produce endurance. Then that endurance forges a proven character. And finally, that hard-won character creates this deep, resilient hope, not just wishful thinking, but a hope that's grounded in real, lived experience.
And so, in the end, the way you respond becomes its own powerful testimony. The sources suggest that when someone goes through hardship with humility, with grace, and maybe even with joy, their very life becomes a living argument for the truth of what they believe.
And that brings us to the final, really challenging question posed by our sources. It takes this entire theological framework and makes it intensely personal and immediate. It asks, in this moment, in our lives, how do we make the most of this? How does a person apply these principles of expectation, of a nonviolent response, of finding purpose in suffering, right here, right now?